Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome back to the Church Leadership Podcast. So thankful that you're here for today's episode. And today's episode, like every episode, we have this goal, we have this mission to encourage and equip you to lead in the local church, to be a disciple and make disciples. And so our prayer is that today's discussion and episode will do just that. And so I'm Mark Gainey, and I'm here with my co-host, Andy Frazier. And we're excited about this conversation we're going to have today, Andy.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention real quick a shout out and thank you to our sponsor for this episode. We don't have one. That's just a joke. It's not that we would not want one, but Mark and I do this. We're just poor boys from poor families, I guess you could say. But we just love
like a
to
song.
Equip and encourage and help any way we can. So we find time out of our schedules to do this, and we're grateful to be able to do it. I'm grateful for our friendship, our relationship, Mark, and I think maybe that's something we could talk about today, is how we as ministers and staff and pastors and church leaders should really be intentional about leaning into our relationships.
Absolutely. So there's no secret that Andy and I are great friends. And really and truly, this podcast that we've done the last several years has been one of the joys of our ministry. But it would not have been that way had it not been for our relationship and our friendship. So what we're talking about today is really leaning into relationships in ministry. And the reason I think it's so important is because we have the tendency to do the opposite. Some of you may not, but if you're like me, you do. You have the tendency in ministry to be task oriented because there's so much to get done. Sunday's always coming. There's always more to do. And so the tendency is to neglect relationships so that we can get business done, right? To quote a comedy, getting business done. So, but that's not what God's called us to.
No.
Just as followers of Jesus, that's not what God's called us to. So certainly as leaders in the local church, he has not called us to that. We see all over Scripture that life of faith, a life of following Jesus, church in the New Testament, God's ecclesia, called out gathering, is a gathering, and it's people, and relationships are at the core of it. The truth is, if you're trying to do ministry without leaning into relationships, you're not doing ministry, you're doing a job. And
yeah, if you're leading in ministry, Mark, it's not this transactional thing. We're not trying to get something accomplished by using people around us to do that. The whole purpose of this podcast today is just talk about we need relationships. We need to be in community and have those kind of relationships. And that's something we have to be intentional about. You mentioned we get so busy, and we get so focused on accomplishing tasks and getting things done. But the other thing too is we tend to build walls to keep from getting hurt. And we're going to talk a little bit about those things today.
Absolutely. So we want to give you some kind of top level thoughts about relationships, and then we're going to get pretty quickly into the nitty gritty and some practical steps and how to do that in your life. And so, look, it's not hard to find. It's impossible to miss. In fact, when you open up the pages of the New Testament, especially, and you look at the life and the ministry of Jesus, everywhere he went, everything he did was in the context of relationships. In fact, so often the masses of people would crowd him, and what did he do? He often withdrew, first of all, to lonely places and prayed, so that relationship with the Father, but then he also withdrew to the few, the 12, and then, of course, Peter, James, and John, the 3 relationships. That defined Jesus's ministry. And our good friend Daniel Edmonds says that so often we get it backwards. We want to, we want to lead the masses and love the few, when really we're supposed to, love the masses, but lead the few. And we're supposed to lean into those relationships. So everywhere you look, Jesus is about relationships. So if he was about it, why would we think that we shouldn't be?
Yeah, we tend to look at the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus and think, salvation is impossible without him. And that's so true. But we tend to neglect the example of Jesus. We think he was perfect and I could never reach the bar of perfection, as God's child that Jesus reached. That doesn't mean we should not try to follow in his steps and do what Jesus did. And Mark's right. I mean, you cannot neglect, you cannot ignore the fact that Jesus was highly relational. Number one on his relationship list was with the Father, that vertical relationship he had with the Father, and everything horizontal flowed out of his relationship with the Father. He didn't do anything except what the Father wanted him to do, and he was led to do exactly what he had heard from his Father and was instructed to do by his Father with others based on his relationship with God. So our relationships are only going to be as healthy as our ultimate relationship with our Father. And we need to look to Jesus as our perfect example for that.
That's a great point, Andy. I think there's really no use in trying to lean into relationships with others if we're neglecting the relationship with the Father. And we talked about that on episode 161. And so you can go back and listen to that if you missed it. But so I want to talk about too, the importance, not just biblically, not because God said to do it, but I want to talk about the importance of leaning into relationships in our own lives, in our own ministries. I think number one, the reason you should do this, if you're hearing this podcast, you're thinking, yeah, I don't have time for that. The reason you should do it is because I think, when we're intentional about relationships in our lives, as pastors, as staff members, as church leaders, I think it helps prevent burnout, which again, we talked about last episode. It prevents isolation.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get isolated in ministry. I mean, I have known pastors, I know you have, Andy, who are in their offices with the door shut all day, every day, completely isolated from other people that they're supposed to be ministering to, serving and leading. And it's impossible to do that if you're isolated. And so when you make it an intentional part of your life, that helps prevent that isolation.
And it's so easy to do that because, going back to what we said earlier, there's so much to be done. There's the sermon prep that needs to be done. There's the committee and teamwork in your church. Those groups and those people need to be led, and the vision and the mission has to work. But we can't isolate ourselves. I think we've talked about that before. I mean, when someone is isolating themselves and they're removing themselves from encouragement and accountability, and oftentimes our personal isolation comes when we are not having that ongoing vertical relationship with the Father that we need to have. So those two things go hand in hand. We can't do that and be the person in relationship with God we need to be, and we can't do that and be the person in relationship with others that we need to be, and it leads us to get everything out of whack. And we need to recognize there should be a priority in our relationships. Not only should we not isolate ourselves, but we need to be careful about who we spend the most quality time with.
Absolutely. So I think a benefit of doing this, we've already mentioned it, but I think a benefit of doing this is you're a better person. You're a better leader. If you're a pastor, you're a much better pastor when you have these relationships in your life. And so we talk about, when we disciple others, kind of three kinds of relationships everybody should have. You should have a Paul, you should have a Barnabas, you should have a Timothy. And what we mean by that is you should have somebody pouring into you. That's your Paul, and somebody who's encouraging you to follow Jesus, to holding you accountable. You should have a Barnabas. That's somebody who's walking with you, kind of the same place that Paul is typically ahead of you. in life and experience. Barnabas is right there with you. Have those Barnabas people, and then have a Timothy, at least one, people who you're leading and you're pouring into. I think it's healthy to have all three of those. And listen, life is better that way. Ministry is better that way. It's more enjoyable. You're going to be a more content, happy, encouraging person to be around. And look, so we've talked about this on the podcast before too, but Andy and I, we're not saying this to brag, but we're just encouraging you that God has this for you too. Okay. And it may take a minute to get there, but we have a text group of brother pastors that I'm telling you, every single Sunday morning, typically for me tends to be high task oriented. And so I typically don't respond till later to those texts, but it's begun even Saturday night now. Andy sent a message Saturday night 2 weeks ago. And so it's happened twice where they're praying for me and everybody in that group. And it's so, I cannot even explain to you how encouraging it is to know that there are other people walking the same journey I'm walking, even though the contexts are different, who love me, who are thinking about me, and who are praying for me in my church. And that would never happen if I hadn't made relationships a priority and spent time with those people. It is such a joy. And I'm telling you, I'm a better person. I'm a better pastor because of those relationships.
Yeah, we need those relationships. We do not need to isolate. It's so easy to be removed from those needed relationships because let's be honest, there's no perfect relationship because relationships are between imperfect sinners, and it takes work. It takes intentionality. It takes effort. We can't expect to have friends unless we're going to be a friend. That old proverbial truth still stands. And we as pastors and church leaders, we tend to have the mindset that people will come to us and pursue those relationships with us. But honestly, it's just the opposite. We have to be intentional about pursuing those relationships with other people. And I mentioned a while ago, I think we have to be careful to prioritize our time and energy when we're in those intentional relationships. We talked a minute ago, the number one thing we need to be intentional about is being vertical. Recognizing our relationship with the Heavenly Father, abiding in Christ. Everything is going to flow from that. But those horizontal relationships, we need to recognize that our family, our spouses and our kids, they need the best version of us as possible. And if we're giving all of our time, all of our attention, all of our energy to other people, then our spouses and our kids are not going to have the best version of us in our relationship with them. But even in those concentric circles, moving out from, our relationship with Jesus, our relationship with family, we need to prioritize even relationships within and without the church. We need to make sure we're investing in people, the Pauls and Timothys and Barnabases in our life. We want to make sure somebody has time to invest in us, but also we need to make sure we have time to invest in others too, because that's what Jesus did. Right, Mark?
That's exactly right. And look, let's be honest. There are going to be seasons of your life where you have more investment opportunity in relationships than others. There's going to be a season in your life, like for example, for Andy and I, the last several months, the focus for us has been investing in our families. And there are going to be times where you're not going to have as much time to invest in the Paul and Timothy's and Barnabas's outside of your home. You're going to need to lean into your family, and different seasons call for different investment times, and you need to recognize that. But no matter what season you're in, you have to be intentional. Like Andy said, you've got to be intentional, because the tendency is not to feed into those, and it takes work. It does take plan. It takes intentionality. So let's talk about some practical steps that you can implement in your life. I think one of the practical steps for me is to make space and time for conversations. Okay. What I mean by that is, again, on Sunday morning, it can be high task time for me. I've got stuff to get done, and I'll just be real with you. It's really easy for me on Sunday mornings to pass by someone and give them a wave and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" and keep going. But I got to be intentional about making space and time to have those conversations. That means I've got to plan ahead. I've got to plan ahead for tasks so that when I'm around others, I have time, I have space, I have margin to really be in conversation, not just to be there, but to really hear them, to really listen and engage in those conversations. So I know that's one way I think that I need to be more intentional about in practical steps in leaning to relationships. And I think the other one we're going to talk about, Andy, is we need to practice being vulnerable and transparent in our relationships.
Yeah, it's so hard to do, but we know it's necessary. You need people who you are transparent with, who are able to speak truth in your life, ask you tough questions, and walk with you, because it is impossible to do what God's called us to do on our own. He did not isolate us or put us on an island. We need community. We need relationships. We need our family. We need those close to us, like Mark was talking about a while ago. But even outside of that, we need to be a little bit vulnerable and risk to have friendships within the church. I know
Mm,
people who have been through tough seasons of ministry in church, and when they serve somewhere, they put these walls up and they won't let people get close to them. And they wonder why they're miserable, or they wonder
mm,
why their interactions and relationships with people in the church are not where they need to be. I think it's worth the risk. As a matter of fact, I think it is exactly what Jesus wants us to do, is to
mm.
put ourselves in a position that's risky, and he rewards that risk. I think with oftentimes with some really, really good friendships. And
Mm.
you're going to get hurt. It's a guarantee. People are going to let you down. People are going to do things and say things that are wrong or sinful or evil, and they're going to do those things sometimes on purpose. Sometimes they're going to do them without meaning to. But
Mm.
regardless, you're going to get hurt. It is a recipe for disaster when God calls you to ministry, because you're going to be misunderstood and you're going to be hurt. But that does not give us any reason whatsoever to hold back from pursuing relationships with people.
That's right. I had an older pastor years ago tell me, hey, well, you need to find some friends out of the church because you don't need to make friends with people in the church. I was young, and I was like, what is he talking about? I mean, I thought, well, he's older and wiser than me, but man, he was not wiser than me. Okay, he may have been older, but he didn't know what he's talking about. That was a
That sounds
hurt
like somebody
person.
who's been hurt in a
That's
church, right?
exactly right. Somebody who's been hurt, and he was guarding, and he was trying to tell me to guard. Thankfully, I didn't listen to him because I think it's important for us to have deep friendships within the
Yeah.
church and without, like Andy said. So I think another step for me, we need to leverage those opportunities in our church for relationships. So if we're preaching, if we are leading people to be involved in community, in small groups, life groups, Sunday school, in D groups, and different environments, community groups, we need to leverage those same opportunities in our lives.
Absolutely.
First of all, it's empty and hollow to say you need to be involved in a life group when you're not involved in one. But you can say that for others, but the same is true for yourself. You need it as well. And so you've got to model that for others, but you need it. And so leverage
Absolutely.
the opportunity you have right there in front of you in your church to do that.
Yeah, your people will recognize very quickly by your lack of involvement and participation and intentionality in small groups or Sunday school or life groups. If you're not pursuing that, well, I guarantee you they're not going to be really adamant about pursuing it themselves. And the other thing, I think, an example that we set as ministry leaders in the local church is our relationships outside of the church.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to get in our little isolated bubble when we don't isolate ourselves. The way we isolate ourselves beyond personally is we create a wall of people around us that we're comfortable with, and we don't go outside of those relationships. I know for all of the years that I served bivocationally, it was very, very easy to be around unchurched and lost people and build relationships with and friendships with them. But when you're in full-time ministry, as Mark said a while ago, the temptation is to hole up in your office. And it's hard. It is really hard, because the last time I checked, most of us who serve in the local church don't have people beating down the doors of our office to get in to talk with us and build relationships with us who are unchurched or don't know Christ. So we have to pursue ways to be out in our community and in our neighborhoods and develop relationships, because to me, I think that most effective evangelistic method there is to build relationships with people who don't know
Mhm.
Christ and to introduce them to Jesus just by your love and your life. And obviously you have to share the gospel with them at some point, but people are not going to trust you or trust what you believe in unless they see that lived out in relationship with them.
That's exactly right. And that actually leads me to the last practical step that I have for you in leaning into these relationships. And it's something that I'm convicted of right now. So, what I'm telling you is something I'm going to try to put into practice right now because I've been convicted of this. And that is, I need to create a regular rhythm for connection in my life. So, here's what I mean by that. In my life, here's what that looks like. I'm starting to schedule at least one coffee meeting so I can just have conversation with a person every week starting next week. And that may be somebody in my church. It may be a friend. It may be Andy. It may be another leader. And so I'm going to be intentional in creating that rhythm because for me, if I don't have that rhythm in my life, before I know it, I look around and I'm isolated again. And so that may be somebody that doesn't know Jesus, like Andy just talked about. But I'm gonna create a rhythm in my life, in my weekly routine, where I have time and space to have a conversation with somebody outside the walls of the church. Now, it may be a church member, but it's not going to be in the church facility, because I think that's important. Where you spend your time is important as almost as who you spend it with. So when you
Absolutely.
spend it with people inside the church all the time, I think it limits the vulnerability, the transparency, the authentic nature of a relationship. When you're out in the world, out in life, doing life together, that makes a big difference. And so I think that's another step that I would encourage you to take, is that I'm going to try to take myself, is to create a rhythm of relationships and conversation.
Yeah, and you're not going to be able to be that friend to people or have the kind of relationships that people need if you don't go back and understand the most basic, needed, foundational relationship we have is with Jesus. So, I mean, you're going to have the leeches and vampires in your life who just try to suck everything out of you, and you're going to have people that God brings into your life that encourage you and invest in you, and then you're going to have people who need you. They need your spiritual guidance. They need your witness in their life. But we need people in our lives too, and we cannot neglect that. We have to be intentional, and as Mark said earlier, we have to lean into that, and that is an intentional thing that we do that is much needed. We have to be careful leading in the local church that we do not neglect relationships.
That's exactly right. You have to lean in because the natural tendency is to lean out.
Mm-hmm.
So we hope that this has been an encouragement to you as you lead in your church, as you seek to make disciples in your church. Do it in the context of relationships. Be intentional. Spend time investing in and cultivating relationships, not just for your benefit, but for the benefit of the kingdom. And so we hope this has encouraged you, and we thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.